Innovation Needs an Address. This is episode 2, everything you should know about analytics. This session I'm really excited for because we're going to be walking through some very complex themes that will bring down to a level that everyone can leave thinking that they got some value and thinking that they were educated on a topic that is so pertinent to their lives, but they maybe didn't know was as important as it is. So to begin, I just want to introduce the 4 lovely people that I have on the call with me today. We have 4 esteemed panelists from 4 very exciting categories within analytics. First, we have Mr. Dan Height. He is the VP and GM of Data Partnerships at NextNav. Dan spent almost 20 years in technology and digital media, 7 years as an executive of Ground Truth, which was formerly XAD, and 9 years in senior leadership positions at Thrive, formerly DexYP. And now at NextNav, Dan is introducing the company's next generation location infrastructure, including the Z-axis, which will provide floor level determination for use with public safety and first responder communities. And that may sound like a lot, but I'm very much looking forward to Dan extrapolating on that in today's panel because it's a really exciting new category in analytics. Next up, we have Mr. Michael Neal, the head of global sales at AdMobilize. Mike is a graduate from Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, Florida. He is a multiple-time founder himself. And at AdMobilize, they are building AI and computer vision platforms for the physical world. Now, AdMobilize aims to use real-time primary data to drive powerful experiences in digital out-of-home advertising, in retail, and experiential and other for consumers. Now, in Mike's own words, relevance in messaging and content has never been more important in today's world. And that fits right in with today's theme, and I'm looking forward to expanding on those ideas with Mike. Next up, we have Miss Amanda Dorenberg. She is the Chief Information Officer at FrontRunner Technologies. Now, Amanda's work has been featured in the Forbes Tech Council, Wired magazine, and among other top national and international media outlets. Amanda is a recent nominee of Canada's Top 40 Under 40, a member of the Forbes Technology Council, TechTO, and most recently the Mobile Co-Chair of IAB, the Interactive Advertising Bureau of Canada. At FrontRunner, Amanda is responsible for the development of all MarTech, AdTech, and data tech strategies and product offerings, as well as growth marketing within media, advertising, and tech communities. And I can personally vouch for her work at FrontRunner and within those councils that she's on. And finally, last but not least, we have Mr. Sam Rowe, the founder and CEO at Docma. Now, Sam is bridging the gap between data science and advertising. Sam consults Fortune 500 advertisers on how to maximize ROI using advertising response models and optimal controls. His experience has produced internationally recognized, award-winning work for innovation, and his vision for ad science software is literally changing the way brands make investment decisions to maximize their returns. So there you have it. That is our amazing esteemed panel. I myself am Matt Steffen. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer, the Chief MarTech Officer at FrontRunner Technologies. And I'm absolutely honored to walk through a discussion on everything you should know about analytics with our panelists today. We've laid out some themes for the conversation, just that will guide this. We're gonna chat through these themes about 10 minutes on each, giving us about a 40-minute panel. We will open up some time at the end for Q&A. And the themes are mobile data, econometrics and data modeling, navigation data, and finally, computer vision. So to kick things off, opening up this idea of mobile data, I wanted to start with you, Amanda. And the question that I have for you is, what is mobile app location data, and how are companies using it today?
Sure. Thank you so much. Great introductions as well. So very simply put, mobile application data is information that is collected from the hundreds of apps that we all install on our cellular devices, our smartphones, whether they're Android, whether they're Apple devices. We all have applications that we love. We have games, we have news, we have sports apps that are giving us the latest and greatest updates. And each of these apps, when we install them onto our phones, have an opt-in to collect some information about, how we're using those applications, where we're going on our daily routines. So running in the background, it collects something called location data, and location data really is just that. It's where your device is and how it's moving. There are obviously privacy regulations that restrict how often certain apps are allowed to collect information, and privacy concerns about personal information is not collected. But generally speaking, it's patterns of movement in terms of where your device is, how long it's been persistently static or just resting in a specific location, whether that's your home location or your work location. Engagement information, so general data about how you're using specific apps and the types of content you're engaging with. So, I'm a dog lover, so I engage with a lot of dog content. I love basketball, so if I'm reading sports updates, it's typically surrounding basketball. These are some of the insights that the applications are collecting, and that would fall within the bucket of mobile application data.
So one of the interesting things that you brought out there is this idea of persistence. You said persistence of location. What can companies pull from persistence of location, and what exactly does that mean?
Sure, it's a great question. So we at FrontRunner and many companies actually use persistent location information. And what that means is it's examining the cellular device's location over a set period of time. So, we call something a look back study, where we're understanding a cellular device's location during the hours, let's say, of 12 midnight to 4 a.m. over a 12-month period. And that allows us or companies to understand or make assumptions that that would be your home location. And so from that, we would get a long and lat that is telling us where that device's home location is. And then we can actually, in turn, utilize that and get an FSA or a postal code or a zip code or a census sort of block area, and look at census data and other data to understand consumer behaviors, consumer demographics, lifestyle patterns. And from a brand or an advertising or a marketer's perspective, this is very powerful information because it allows us to be able to send or deliver appropriate content to our customers or to our client base, or more relevant content even.
Super interesting. And I mean, it ties into what you were saying, in the first part there as well, about the type of content we're interacting or engaging with. And my question for you is, we hear this all the time. I was talking to my parents about this week. My apps are listening to me because, my mom was looking at something and my dad's getting ads for it. Do you think that, these apps are listening to you, or is there a different location-based, data at play here?
Yeah, I mean, we always run into these questions and these scenarios where people are like, my apps are listening to me. Like, I was talking to my boyfriend about a product that we needed for our terrace, and then 20 minutes later I was getting delivered ads on Instagram for it, or he was looking at cars and I'm getting delivered ads. A lot of it also has to do with your Wi-Fi connection. So you're on your mobile device. When you're in your home, you connected to your Wi-Fi, so your IP address running in the background, IP Internet Protocol address, which allows us to have a connection to the internet, let's say. You're sharing that, right? So if one person in the household is looking at cars, then the other person will very likely be engaged with some sort of content that is relevant to cars. One of the interesting things, just to sort of go back to the core of mobile application data. I'm not sure if anybody, I know Dan, you and I have talked about this in great detail, but Apple's recent announcement about iOS 14 is really going to be a game changer in the mobile application space, and to all of these application publishers who run SDKs in the background that are providing us this information, this geolocation information, this sort of behavioral segmentation information, because it gives the power back to the consumer to be able to block providing that information to these application publishers, and therefore those publishers providing it to organizations like us. So I think that's going to be really, really interesting to watch how this $80 billion industry unfolds without the IDFA.
Interesting. So a term that you used there was SDK. Now,
Yes.
Can you explain to the audience what exactly an SDK is, and how is that the sort of bridge between something like a mobile app and companies that are trying to build these audiences or learn more about consumers?
Sure, yeah. And SDK is a software development kit, and essentially it's a piece of or a section of code, let's say, that sits within the background of a mobile application that collects this information and then sends it back to a server that's existing in the cloud, where the publisher of that app can then utilize that information and sell it to companies like FrontRunner or to Sam at Docma. And then we can use that and extrapolate it into other information, let's say.
So the information that those SDKs are collecting, is everybody getting the same information, and it's up to the company to analyze it in a way that makes sense for them? Is that sort of the way that would work?
It really depends on how the SDK is built, right? So the developer of the SDK or the software development kit is going to, within the code that they're writing, request specific information from the mobile application. And then ultimately, when the application is used, based on the code that was developed, it's going to collect that appropriate information that was requested from the code.
Interesting. And then, so Apple's recent announcement, for those that may not have seen, they're basically announcing that those SDKs are going to have, are they not allowing them, or is it just limited power? They can't do as much as they maybe once were doing.
As far as I'm aware, and Dan, you can chime in here on this as well, because you and I have sort of bantered back and forth, but as far as I'm aware, it's giving the full power back to the end user, where it blocks entirely. Dan, do you have
there's actually two components to it. One is on the precision of location. So you can either have precise location, or you can have approximate location. An approximate location is a 10-mile radius. So if your app is not
huge
of, I need to know what store is right next to me, or what restaurant is right there, or what the weather is right near me. Approximate is better. So it gives that option to the user. And the other is the ability from the app itself to allow or not allow that app to track you. So regardless of whether you're using precise or approximate location, it gives the power to the user to decide, do they want to give that tracking capability to the application.
Wow, interesting. That is going to be a huge shakeup. Yeah, Sam.
I had a question for Amanda and Dan. Just because this is such a fresh announcement, it's wonderful to be able to chat with you guys. A lot of companies have shifted into the mobile data collection space and put a lot into it because it's so reliable and exciting and fresh, and really providing opportunities for companies to make money. As this space evolves, who do you think is going to win in this space, and based on what kind of adoption do you think that they're going to need to make?
Well, I think as Voltaire said, or maybe for everyone else, Spider-Man said, with great power comes great responsibility. But it's this adage, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And Apple, because they don't make money from advertising, is more consumer oriented than maybe Google is right now, which is basically an advertising platform. So I think the jury is still a little bit out. These are certainly new. How consumers are going to react to it, I think, is questioned right now. I think what you will see is a little bit of a similar behavior that we saw from ad blockers that went on online onto browsers, And if you really value that content and you have two choices, you either pay for it and go behind a paywall and get it, or you allow the ad blocker to not be invoked on that particular site. So I think it's really incumbent upon the publisher to provide a consumer experience that somebody's either willing to pay for or allow that to be tracked and monetize it through advertising. But the early read right now is that I think this is going to make the larger players more powerful, and it's going to become a blocking mechanism for smaller players, much like GDPR had in Europe.
Yeah, I also think, you know, and this panel is good representation of that, because we're trying to simplify these concepts of very complex analytic and data offerings. And even on the topic of mobile application data, a lot of us in the general public aren't aware of what's being collected, right? So, you know, the volume of people who are actually going to say, oh no, don't track me, because they don't even really understand what that means, you know? So, you know, I agree. I think it's going to be interesting to see, but I do think that a lot of us, I like relevant content that's being delivered to me. I don't want to see ads for something that isn't of interest to me. You know, I want to see content that relates to me. So that's sort of my perspective.
It is a very interesting panel, and I know, Mike, you've been sitting quietly, maybe with a little smile behind that beautiful mustache, thinking about computer vision as really sitting above these issues of mobile app and data collection, because what you guys are really doing is it's installing your own hardware, right? And what, maybe you can just sort of shed some light on what computer vision analytics is and how it compares or contrasts to what we've sort of been speaking about up until now.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting time for what we do, right? And over the past, 5 or 10 years, computer vision as a technology has been emerging pretty rapidly, even though it's been around for quite some time. But if I were to boil it down, computer vision is basically a computer program that processes images or video to gather data, right, or answer a question. So these questions can be as simple as if there's a photo of dogs, how many dogs are in this photo, right? Or they can be as complex as something like Apple Face ID, which you use to unlock your phone via facial recognition, right, and personalization. In today's world, it's been interesting because unfortunately, due to a lot of the mass shutdowns that COVID brought starting in March, different analytic systems that were banking on historical data, majority extrapolation, or even some predictive models, kind of all were thrown out the window to some degree, right? Because of how everything was just disrupted in such a major way. I think a lot of people were hoping that this would be a 60 to 90 day sort of event, right? But it appears that it's going to be a bit longer, unfortunately. So those models will be, continue to be disrupted. I think maybe for good. I think it'll be interesting to see how it pans out. But a computer vision, the type of data that it provides as a technology is based on sensors. So camera sensors that are on site, let's say on a billboard or at the entrance of a retail store or property. And these are collecting data in real time, 24/7, presumably, and allowing different types of users and companies to understand at any given moment, let's say, how many people walked into my store today, right? How many cars drove by this billboard on this highway, as an example.
So to really simplify it, it's a technology that it's like a camera that can tell you what it's looking at and feed that information into a spreadsheet that you can analyze in whatever way you want.
That's correct.
Awesome. Very cool. And Sam, I know you cracked a bit of a smile there as we got into this idea of, predictive modeling potentially being disrupted forever. And I didn't want to open it up to you because I know you just, not too long ago, you went out on your own with DOCMA. And that is, as far as I understand, a big part of what you do is predictive modeling and modeling with data. So maybe you could speak to that a little bit for us.
Sure. Yeah. I'm very passionate advocate for data collection and advertising. As you had mentioned in the intro, I just try to bridge the gap between math or data science and advertising. And so, what we kind of do is look at, a wide range of data collection. And I can even try to bring in a little bit of the mobile tracking discussion as well. And we try to understand the cause and effect relationship between a company's sales and all of their initiatives in the advertising space. And that's really helpful because a lot of advertisers will invest into their advertising campaigns, but find it very challenging to understand what component of their advertising campaign is actually driving a return on investment. So, the practice of predictive modeling, or essentially what you have listed here on the screen, econometric modeling, is understanding the relationship between how you're spending and how it's affecting your sales. So, the landscape's been changing with mobile data quite significantly. Something we do now is we're actually able to collect your device IDs as they pass by billboards, as Mike had alluded to. And that helps us understand sort of these legacy advertising spaces and helps us model the true effectiveness of a billboard's impact on a company's revenue. So, it's a pretty evolving space. It's pretty exciting. I think that some of the other discussions that we were having around IDFA, being those device IDs and how Apple's disrupting the industry, is going to change the way my business operates. And I think that companies are going to really need to think about their adoption strategy in terms of what kind of data they're collecting. But ultimately, I think that when it comes down to predictive modeling and helping get a good understanding of how advertising affects your business, I think it comes down to, it's very simple, which is a practice. For as long as I can remember, the landscape's been rapidly evolving and changing. And, there's new, almost every single year, sometimes every single quarter, there's new ways we can collect data. So it really comes down to the fundamental ideology and your school of thought of how you want to study your business and study the investments you make into your business. And that really comes down to, that really helps you influence what kind of data you're going to collect to understand the relationship between the investments you make and the sales that you garner.
The term that I love there is that idea of investing in your business. And Mr. Height, one of the questions I had for you today was this idea of the massive investments that NextNav is putting into their business and looking at the next generation of data and analytics. So can you speak to some of the investments that NextNav is making and simplify those concepts for our audience?
Sure. So maybe I'll take it up a level on what we're solving for and put it in real terms so people kind of understand it. So when you think opening up a Google Maps or hailing an Uber and you're standing inside of a building and you get that big blue circle. The reason why you get that big blue circle is you can't get line of sight to a GPS satellite. It's really that simple. I don't care whether you're Google, whether you're Apple, whether you're Uber, anybody. GPS, there's 28 orbital satellites, they're 12,000 miles in the air. It's really as simple as that. And there's no vertical dimension to that. And so what we're trying to solve for is how do you solve for infrastructure that was not designed for what it's being tasked with doing? GPS satellites were not designed to find people or to hail cars or to get you to a date. That's not what it was designed to do. It was designed to detect missiles launched from the Soviet Union. That's what it was designed for. So now we're asking it to make dates, hail cars, deliver food, and find people. And that's not what it was, so what we're trying to do is build new infrastructure that is designed specifically for that. So imagine calling 911 15 years ago. We all had landlines, they were connected, you knew exactly where it was. If you're in an emergency, they can get to you very fast. If you can't speak or there's a language barrier, they still know where you are because they know the physical line and where it's connected. Move to a mobile world, none of those are connected. So imagine calling from a 100-story building and you can't talk imagine a firefighter trying to clear 100 stories to try and find you. It's not going to happen, and it leads to loss of life or delays in getting people there. And that's what we're solving for, is better accuracy within building infrastructure for public safety. Now, the use cases obviously are beyond public safety. GPS, again, was designed for threat assessment from the Soviet Union, but obviously we built new ecosystems on it. So we think that this will be very similar.
Now, that idea of infrastructure, Mike, I want to get your commentary on this as well, because, you know, is AdMobilize stuck to the infrastructure? Like, are you building physical hardware, or is computer vision and what you're building, can you layer it onto existing infrastructure, and what might that infrastructure look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. So at AdMobilize, we do a bit of both, right? And, you know, we, in some projects, we provide hardware that essentially starts to build out the infrastructure of having a sensor that collects data for, you know, some use case, right? However, there are a lot of use cases or a lot of users that already have some sort of infrastructure. Let's say IP security cameras on location, right? Any big box retailer, any mall, any office building for that matter is going to have some sort of camera network. And a lot of these networks have been updated over the past couple of years and continue to be updated to a standard that allows for these use cases that leverage computer vision technology, right? So what this is allowing is a lot of these emerging use cases, let's say even COVID related, such as trying to cap or monitor occupancy inside of a location to maintain social distancing, have become a lot less expensive to implement and a lot easier to implement maybe than they would have been 10 years ago, right? So that's all helping in terms of just implementing this kind of solution in the way that it needs to be implemented to be effective.
Now, it's really interesting to think that there's, you know, buildings that have these cameras that, Dan, like you were saying, were maybe designed for one thing, but now with new technologies and softwares, they can be repurposed for, you know, almost giving them superpowers, right? To begin to count people or see who's wearing a mask or who's not wearing a mask. Now, the question that I have, and maybe Amanda, I'll open this up to you, is as we think about infrastructure and as we think about, you know, all of how this data connects, a big buzzword that's been floating around and nobody really knows what it means is 5G and 5G networks. Maybe you can help us understand what 5G is going to do for, you know, analytics and what we've been talking about today.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You know, from an infrastructure standpoint, as Dan had mentioned, our lives used to be wired and connected, and as we transitioned into a mobile space and a mobile world, we've gone through many iterations of cellular carrier infrastructures. We've gone through CDMA infrastructures, which was, you know, back in the 90s, let's say. We've gone to 3G, or from 3G to 4G, and now to 5G. And, you know, what does it really mean? It's bigger, better, faster, the ability to have, you know, instantaneous speeds, instantaneous speeds. But it is really a big buzzword. I think, you know, from a data standpoint, certainly it will allow us to collect information faster. From an infrastructure standpoint, it will allow us to feed content to digital billboards, you know, more instantaneously through programmatic exchanges. I think it will allow us to have visibility into, you know, more information from a location standpoint. It should be very interesting to see how it actually changes, not just the advertising space or the data collection space, but even just like consumer behaviors and business behaviors. And yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting.
I wanted to riff off that, Amanda, a little bit. So I was having a discussion with one of my clients about it, and it was kind of interesting because 5G, some people know it a lot better than others. And, I have no problem admitting that I'm still kind of wrapping my head around it myself. But I like the way that this was described to me. So Dan, if you feel like you want to jump in on this, that's cool. But, like a friend of mine said that the way it's kind of used in England is where I believe it's a little bit further developed, is that these devices are now becoming wireless routers. They're, because of the speed and efficiency by which we can transmit signals from this through a 5G network. Think of it as, how many people tether to their computer when the internet's bad? Think of it like that for everything, right? Like when you want to connect to your PlayStation or maybe your smart fridge, you can start using your phone almost as this wireless router to improve how the speed of the efficiency of your internet connection. And as that infrastructure evolves and develops, we'll start seeing different types of technology, 5G technology installed throughout our actual societal infrastructure, like street lamps, as an example, or maybe at a gas station, perhaps, maybe not the best example. But from a data collection standpoint, we talk about, at the beginning of this conversation, we discussed SDKs and how SDKs are sort of our Trojan horse as advertisers into the world of consumers through their cell phones. But as that goes away, we need to replace that somehow. And I'm just kind of trying to relate to Randall in here a little bit as well, who in the chat was asking questions about data collection. I think that 5G, as SDK and cookies are on their way out, and as 5G comes in, these signals that are transmitting from our wireless routers, that are pinging off different types of 5G infrastructure throughout our cities, will help us, as advertisers, continue building understanding for location behavior of different types of consumers. My expertise and knowledge at this point sort of tails off. I'm excited to see how different advertisers or different companies adapt to this, extrapolate that data to perhaps census population to get better, signals in terms of what demographics are going where. And hopefully that is, a potential solve in the near future for us as we experience turbulence.
So maybe I can give a perspective on this too. It's actually the worst thing for the wireless industry to call it 5G. People think of it as this natural step evolution from 3G to 4G to 5G, and it's not. It's a giant leap. This is a entirely new technology platform that will be unleashed. And it's not just that you'll be able to download a movie in 30 seconds. You will, yes. And to a consumer, they will see things just move faster for them, sure. They will be able to not be tethered to their Wi-Fi systems at home because that will seem slow compared to what 5G is. It's really it's two things. It's going to remove the latency that we all experience. And this is for layman people. You're watching a movie and you get the buffering in it. You have to wait for your internet to catch up so you can keep watching it. That's fine if you're annoyed when you're watching Netflix and it slows down or it buffers, you have to wait a second. Not really good for an autonomous car and Sam's crossing the road and it's buffering and doesn't see Sam and it plows him over. That's not a good experience. So you don't want latency.
Actually for me.
For you, you don't want latency ever into an ecosystem, and 5G make latency virtually gone. The other is the sheer number of devices that can be connected. So think about your own use case if you have Wi-Fi at home. As you start bringing over more friends in a non-COVID world that we're living in, but as that starts opening up and you have more people that are connecting to your internet, you notice your speeds go down. Why? Because you're dividing that internet speed over the number of devices. We cannot literally connect all the devices that we have. And this Internet of Things that people have been talking about, where you have all these sensors and you have smart fridges and you have Alexas and you have all these devices, you can't connect all these devices that the world is going to have until you have 5G that is going to greatly increase an order of magnitude of the number of devices that can be connected. So 5G really represents a giant leap forward in connection, not just a step improvement over 4G.
Yeah, just to add, Dan, I'm really happy you brought up the IoT concept, because I was going to say, I think, 5G from a data collection standpoint is really going to open up the opportunity to have much larger data lakes that aren't just inclusive of mobile application data or geospatial data, but also of data coming from IoT devices. And as to Sam's point, as some of these SDKs start to go away, and to Dan's point, as we move into a cookieless world from our traditional, internet connections, it will be very, very interesting to see how data collection companies pivot away from mobile application data into this concept of collecting information from IoT devices, and then how companies like Sam's company will be able to use that information to model and to extrapolate, different consumer behaviors and consumer insights and ROI insights for their clients. I think it'll be very, very interesting. And then crossing that into, Mike's space with the computer vision would be just really cool.
Yeah,
I'll just give you a perspective on the amount of data. I actually was talking to the chief data science officer for GM about 8 months ago. And he said on any given day, GM's connected cars produce 4 times the amount of data that Netflix does. Imagine that. And there's not an ecosystem today that exists to pull that data out, because we don't have internet speeds that are fast enough to transmit that kind of data. That's part of what 5G will start unlocking.
Mike, a question that I have for you is, it was actually, I'm going to put you a little on the spot here because it was a term Amanda used. Can you talk into what a data lake is, and maybe just highlight some of the ways that, the four panelists here could work together?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think, in my mind, a data lake, and there's probably a few definitions for it, but it's, basically a database of different data sources, right? This can be IoT sensors, cameras are an IoT sensor, right? It could be mobile data, weather data, all sorts of data that's used to create analytics, right? And it sounds like Sam and I need to get together and figure some of this stuff out as it relates to IoT sensors, so that we can work with you and Amanda and also Dan to implement it in the media and retail space world, right? And as Amanda mentioned, I think, the basic premise of Immobilize is that data from IoT sensors like cameras and, there's others as well, are becoming more and more important as the mobile analytics space specifically becomes disrupted for all these reasons, but also as connectivity gets better, stronger, with the emergence of 5G and other technologies that enable, in the end, real-time use cases, right? As Dan mentioned, what can we do with all this data that's being generated if we had real-time access to it, right? Or maybe even real or near real-time access, right? The possibilities around putting all those pieces together are, pretty extraordinary, like the next Google or the next Facebook type of potential, we think.
Well, it's also going to change greatly the form factor of what things are. I mean, right now, my phone right here takes up a lot of space for memory, and it takes up a lot of space for the battery. And part of that is because we have to do a lot of device computing on the device itself. As 5G comes out and as that starts to gain traction, you'll be able to push all that, what they call, to the edge, which is basically you're pushing that to the cloud to do the computing, and doesn't necessarily need to take place on the device. So imagine if you didn't have to have as much battery power because you're not doing all this computing on your phone, and it's being done in the cloud, whether that's Amazon or Google or Microsoft or any other cloud application. What could you do with that? Suddenly having a bendable thing that you can put around your wrist doesn't seem that crazy that has that type of thing. So you're going to see great changes in form factor of hardware as well.
So Dan, that reminds me of last night I was helping my mom move photos from her physical computer into her Google Photos account, so she doesn't need to store them on her laptop. Is that basically like similar concept, but for actually doing things like loading apps and stuff like that? Or?
Well, think about it. The whole app ecosystem might change because, again, the apps, depending on the size, they take up memory, they take up space in your phone. And if you don't need that, and you just need a quick front door to Yelp or to Uber or to Tinder or whatever app that you're using, you don't need all that space on there. What else can you do with the size that you've now opened up in the phone itself? So again, most of our phones are taken up by, processors and battery, and that produces two things. It produces weight, size, and heat. And if you can start eliminating some of that stuff and pushing that out to the cloud, so you don't have to do all of that function on your phone, the whole form factor, again, will change.
Hey, Mike, or Matt, sorry, I did actually want to speak to something that you asked to Mike as well. I just kind of wanted to riff off of it a little bit. I wanted to take a step back for a quick second about sort of like the technical aspect of data and analytic collection and talk more about the strategy of data analytics. And, I think one thing that is certain that we can't avoid is change. I think that what we've seen more now in the last, I think like 6 months between Google moving away from cookies and Apple crushing IDFA, one thing that we can 100% guarantee is that change is inevitable. I think traditional business relationships have always been, I sell you something, you sell me something. Here's my infrastructure I created and my product and my service. Do you want to do business with me? And take the value exchange that I'm offering. I think companies that are going to really succeed in the near future and ongoing around that want to implement an effective data and analytics strategy are companies that will benefit from agile relationships and partnerships. And the reason why I say that is, again, just because of all the change that we're experiencing. These big sort of heavy long-term contracts around data and analytics can be scary in such a turbulent and stochastic, randomized world that we're living in, where things are changing so rapidly. I think having a strategy for how you want to look at your data, ultimately ask yourself, what am I trying to do? There's so many options out there for ways you can collect data, build a data lake. You can have all the data in the world. You can maybe retail it, resell it. But ultimately, you have to have a really clear vision of what you want to do with the data. And that'll help you understand what kind of data that you need to collect. And also, if you have a very agile relationship with your partners, then everyone is a little bit more able to adjust to change while sticking to the vision that you build together as a group. So, the people that I work with on this panel, the people who I don't work with on this panel, that's the way, I like to work. I'm finding a lot of success, in the last little while with that type of approach. And I would definitely encourage other people to explore that type of agile relationship where you're working together on strategy and building out a solution where everybody's individual skill set really contributes to the solve.
I think that's a really good point. I love that idea of partnership, and maybe Dan, I'll get some of your thoughts on this as the VP of data partnerships. Is how important are partnerships to NextNav's business, considering you're really pushing the envelope and trying to stand up an infrastructure very quickly? What is that? What is what Sam just spoke to? How does that resonate with you?
Oh, 100%. I think it's to Sam's point. Things are just changing too quickly for anybody to do this. I mean, even the big guys are not doing this all themselves. And so partnerships is going to be, the cornerstone of how companies are going to work together. And there's going to be some cooperative ones. There's going to be some co-opetition around some of those things. Not going to be clear cut on a lot of these things, but partnerships are the foundation of what we're doing as NextNav. I mean, we're solving this for public safety reasons, but that only works because the FCC mandated this get done. And we're in partnerships with the phone carriers to help them from a public safety perspective. And how we start thinking about this for a game developer is very different. One of the other enhancements about 5G is that this is going to change augmented reality and mixed reality, because you're going to be able to see this in near real time. What does that look like? And if you start looking up, well, what does my experience then look like? However, if I'm standing on the 3rd floor and looking down, what does my experience look like? And that's going to come from partnerships. We have a technology, but ultimately it only works if we put it in the right people's hands and they understand what it can be used for and let them play around with it, and how that gets solved for public safety or from security or from better location data, because you don't know whether you're, on the first floor of the Starbucks of a building or 30 floors above it that both have the same latitude, longitude, or the XY, but 30 floors of difference makes all the difference in a context. So, we'll partner with everybody to help them figure those things out. But I 100% agree with Sam's assertion. This is about partnerships because the world is only accelerating.
Amanda, do you have any thoughts to add to that idea of expanding data partnerships, in your role at FrontRunner?
Data partnerships have been key all throughout my career, in any aspect. And obviously my career has been focused specifically in the advertising space. But, I look at the technology that NextNav is building as a great opportunity for some points that Sam had brought up earlier, which is, ROI to your clients. We used to utilize mobile application data to build out attribution studies. So what happens, what did a consumer do post-exposure to a billboard advertisement? Did they walk into a Sephora after seeing a Sephora ad? But, to Dan's point, we couldn't actually tell if it was a mall ecosystem and it had a tower, an office tower above it, if they were actually in the mall or if they were on the 30th floor, because we didn't have that vertical understanding. So, partnerships in general are absolutely huge. And as the world of data and analytics continues to evolve and things, drop off or become unavailable and new things become available, strategic partnerships are going to become more and more prominent and even more important.
And Sam, I'm just going to keep going down the list here because you asked a great question. So Mike, same question to you. At AdMobilize, how are data partnerships playing into your strategy today and into the future?
Yeah, partnerships are kind of the name of the game for us, right? We partner with a lot of different types of companies that use our data to serve some sort of end user use case. All the time. I would say the majority of our clients have direct use cases, such as using a dashboard, right? That's relatively standard. But throughout their business, they have different partners or different technologies that they work with that AdMobilize can improve or be useful in some way, shape, or form. So the ability to form those partnerships, do things like API integrations, make that relatively simple and standard, has become a really important part of our business and probably for any data collection business out there today, right? And I love what Sam mentioned about, these agile use cases and partnerships, and would love to explore that a lot more with him sometimes.
Definitely. I like the idea and the school of thought of agile partnerships in a very rapidly changing world. It takes a little bit of pressure off of needing to deliver on something bigger that is, frankly, sometimes unrealistic by the time you get to the end goal. Working really closely with partners and massaging the solution as you go. I find it creates a lot more value along the way, and it also helps you put a bullet in it earlier if it's not working out too well earlier, instead of investing a lot up front. For instance, like this, not to dive right back down deep into the crushing of the IDFA, but I need to think about that with my business. It is going to affect the way that we model, reach and frequency projections for our advertisers. So, it's interesting, like finding like-minded people who have the same goals and are willing to work really closely with you, be patient with you, win with you, and lose with you. I think those kinds of companies are really going to emerge in such a rapidly changing and challenging space, but also such a great opportunity as well, right? The space is full of opportunity.
That's awesome, man. Thank you so much. And that was a really great vein of the conversation there to get into that idea of partnerships, because You know, we've got 4 amazing panelists here. We're all partners already in some shape or form. So I think this panel is a living testament to that idea of what strategic partnerships mean. We're at, 12:50 here. I want to open it up. We do have some time reserved for question and answer. So if you haven't thrown your questions in the QA box, feel free to do so. We do have a couple that came in. So the first question here is for Dan. It says, reports are coming in that COVID cases are on the rise in some American cities. What role will data have in contact tracing moving forward?
Oh, it's a great question. I think in a perfect world, privacy notwithstanding, we would have an app that people could self-report on that would be used for alerting when you've come in contact with or in a place that somebody tested positive. Unfortunately, we don't live in that world. And even Google and Apple made a pretty unprecedented announcement where 2 competing platforms came together and unleashed a technology that was privacy safe. And so far, only 3 states have adopted that as part of their application for contact tracing. Technology can play a role, but it's only as useful as people engaging with it. And people need to feel comfortable with doing that their data is not going to be used for other reasons, because obviously, especially when you're dealing with health concerns, it can be used in nefarious ways if you want to. So it can play a role. In other countries, it's played a very important role, and their cases have actually dropped because they've been able to do better contact tracing with the use of technology where it wasn't their choice. And again, there's pros and cons of that from a society perspective, but specifically on COVID, technology can, but unfortunately in the US, it's probably not going to be the end all be all.
Because it's such a big question. I'll open it up to any other panelists that want to add some color to. Reports are coming in that COVID cases are on the rise in some US cities. What role will data have in contact tracing? Mike, maybe you want to speak to some of the work that AdMobilize is doing, what computer vision could do on this level.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some emerging use cases that were somewhat obvious in how computer vision or other sensor technologies could help. I mean, I'm sure everyone has seen the temperature reading and scanning type of kiosks, I guess. I think that the jury's still out in how useful that's going to be in kind of curtailing the number of cases, right? I think some of the use cases that are more interesting to us have been around mask detection, right? If that's useful to like a retailer to remain open or to be part of the reopening process, as well as I think I mentioned before, the ability to understand occupancy in any kind of physical space, let's say a retail store, and help them understand if, based on the number of people and the square footage of the store, are people able to maintain a 6 to 10 foot, distance, right, to ensure social distancing. I think some of those have been interesting, and those are some things that we've seen kind of implemented in some way, shape, or form in the field already. I think some of the other ones are, I guess for lack of a better phrase, they are sort of physical buzzwords, I guess you could say, that might be useful or might not. I think the jury's still out a little bit there.
Yeah, no, it's the temperature was the first thing that came to mind for me, as well as how that could maybe feed in. I do want to just highlight, there was a great question that came in the chat, and Dan, thanks for responding to it there. I just wanted to put it out so everyone could hear it. The question was, my understanding was that the user already has the ability to adjust their settings as to when apps are accessing their location data. Is this not the case? Because we did speak a lot about Apple's recent changes to how location data can or cannot be shared with publishers and with data companies. So the answer that Dan provided was, that is correct. So you've always been able to opt out of sharing your location. But this new update that Apple is planned to roll out with iOS 14 is that it will make the opt-in within the app itself and not deep within the settings of the phone, so you have to dig and go find the location data. So is that almost like just so we're clear, Dan, is that almost like a push notification that comes to the forefront right when you open up an app, or are we not positive on how that's going to come through?
So think of it this way. So I'm sure if anyone has an Apple device already and they've been running iOS 11 or newer, which probably most people have, this is where it's reminding you that this app is using your location. Do you want to allow it or not? So that does it right in the app setting versus having to go in and remember to go into the setting profile and change it. And what Apple's going to be doing with this is two, again, fundamental things. One, when you ask for location, precise location or approximate location, and that'll happen within the app. And the other is, do you want this app to track you or not track you? So it's putting it front and center in the application, nothing in the settings. And those are the big changes that they're really doing around this. So it's not that the IDFA, as Sam was talking about, is going away. It's that it's going to be more of an opt-in to allow that tracking. The consumer is actually going to have to do that. And again, as a app developer, your content on the app needs to be something that the consumer really wants, and either they're going to pay for it or allow tracking so that it's better ad monetization. And candidly, there's only so much that a consumer is willing to pay for. This is some of the issues that the video streaming services are having right now. Well, I want to watch this show on this provider and that show on that provider. I'm not going to subscribe to 10 different video on demand platforms, because the whole aspect was I didn't want to have a cable bundle. Well, now we're creating these video on demand bundles, and you have to subscribe to 10 of them to watch all the shows that you want to have. So at some point in time, consumers are going to cry uncle and not pay for everything. Everything can't be behind a paywall, and advertising will stay a mantra of how these things get funded. And there just has to be a little bit more transparency about what people are doing and giving them more access to control their experience.
It's awesome. We're coming up on the last 2 minutes here, so we do have a final question. And Amanda, we opened with you. Why don't we end with you? This one is, do you feel that COVID-19 has pushed consumers to rely on and be more willing to give up data as it helps keep us safe, helping us more in touchless events and environments, etc.?
That's a great question. It's hard to speak in generalities for all consumers, so I'll speak for myself. I was of the mindset of not really sharing my personal information, through my apps or whatever. But I do think the transition with COVID has certainly encouraged consumers to share more information in their either mobile phones or desktops, whatever the case may be. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we're all missing that personal connection. So we're all wanting to find a way to create that virtually again. COVID has pushed us to these virtual panels. We used to all be sitting on a stage together, side by side, and we could go grab a drink afterwards. But now it's all virtually, and I think with that comes a willingness to share more information virtually or digitally. So I do think it has generally provided consumers with the more encouragement or the feeling of safety, being able to share personal information digitally.
Perfect. Well, there you have it. We are at the top of the hour, and I can't thank each one of our panelists enough. Sam, Amanda, Dan, Mike, thank you so much for joining us on episode 2 of our Innovation Needs an Address series. This was Everything You Should Know About Analytics, hosted by FrontRunner Technologies. I hope you'll tune in for episode 3, and we wish you all a wonderful weekend.